You and I were talking about this limited ceasefire, and I know there's a lot of talk about what it is and what it means. There was the Tuesday call between President Trump and President Putin, but then a few hours after that call, it appeared that Russian forces were still striking Ukraine. Where are we right now with this conflict and this alleged limited ceasefire?
I think the limited ceasefire, quote unquote, on energy assets will probably take place. The Ukrainians really want it. Ukraine, through its drone capability, has caused Russia considerable pain with its refining sector. So I think both countries want it. There'll be a more specific list of targets that Zelensky and his government will come up with. Putin will probably agree to it, and I think we'll move forward on that. So on the limited ceasefire on energy assets, I think things are relatively positive.
Relatively positive. How soon could that go into effect? Are we looking at today, tomorrow, or is it going to take a few weeks to negotiate the terms of just this limited ceasefire on energy assets?
I think it'll take a week or two, probably, not much longer. We may need a delegation of Russians and Americans meeting in Riyadh again. But I don't think the target list on the Ukrainian side will be that surprising to anybody. And Putin would like to get that taken care of so they stop shooting at his refining assets. A couple of weeks.
And then what do you think a 30-day limited ceasefire could do in the broader context of this conflict? Does it offer any chance for a permanent and entire ceasefire?
Okay, so look, I think that this limited ceasefire could be followed by a more fulsome ceasefire. And in getting people's arms around that question, I think it's important to think in terms of kind of three buckets of issues that the U.S. and the Russians are talking about. U.S.-Russia normalization of relations, which Putin really wants. European security, a reduction in the U.S. troop presence in Europe, which Putin really wants. And then third is Ukraine, which is probably the most important issue to Putin and the most difficult issue to Putin. But I think it's important to remember the first two buckets. And that will move Putin in his reaction function more towards a somewhat more durable ceasefire. So I think it's a really tough call. It's kind of a jump ball, but we get paid to make calls, and I think my call would be that we'll see a more fulsome ceasefire. Now, if I can continue for a minute here, so we'll likely see a more fulsome ceasefire. The problem is that we have to keep our eye on the ball. If you're moving money, the ball is, will this be a more permanent ceasefire? How long will even a longer ceasefire last? And there, I think, it's important to be clear, in my mind anyway, that this war will likely go on for a very long time in some form. I spent a lot of time around Putin. I think he thinks that Eastern Ukraine is his. It's his view, right? And he doesn't want to leave the quote-unquote Ukraine problem to the next generation of Russians. We don't agree with that view. I don't agree with that view. But again, I've heard him express that many, many times. And so I think this war will go on in one form or another for the rest of Putin's life.
For the rest of Putin's life. What does that mean for Ukrainians and the folks who are still living there?
Well, for Ukrainians, for the folks who are still living there, and for global investors who are looking at Ukraine, and again, I have to distinguish my views from what I think. It's a pretty horrible assessment that I have. But, I kind of try to be genuine here. It's dark. It's dark. I think if there is a ceasefire, for example, I think Russian violations and provocations will continue. I think Russian efforts to destabilize the Ukrainian economy, maybe even, destabilize the Ukrainian leadership, to use, a euphemism, will go on. So I fundamentally don't think Putin will be prepared to live with the Zelensky government long term, first. Secondly, I think Putin's in quite good health, and I think that recipe is one of continued conflict in the region.
So what you just kind of outlined there might mean the cessation of bombing, but the institution of perhaps cyber warfare or economic interference or political interference over the next several decades.
Look, my model for this conflict is Kashmir, not the Koreas, but Kashmir, which is an on and off stable ceasefire, something that most of us would reluctantly call peace, on the one hand, with outbursts, some protracted outbursts at times of violence, as opposed to Korea, which has been a stable armistice, no peace agreement, but a stable armistice for decades and decades. And I think we're headed towards the former, and that's unfortunately a bloody future. And I think that's what we have to expect moving forward. And it's important to remember that as we discuss the ceasefire, because we're talking about a short-term uptick in Ukraine's fortunes. But I don't think it's going to be a durable uptick.